Welcome to Life Stories, where we share transformative journeys of self-discovery, regret, and redemption. Today's story follows Mark Davis, a successful businessman who, after years of chasing power and wealth, is forced to confront the consequences of abandoning his family. When he discovers that he has a son he never knew about, Mark must face the painful truths of his past and the possibility of rebuilding relationships he once thought were lost forever. Join us as we dive into this emotional journey of change and hope. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to begin today's story. The hum of New York's bustling airport filled the air, as it always did on a Friday morning. People rushed from gate to gate, some with a sense of purpose, others simply going through the motions of another day. Among them was Mark Davis, a 45-year-old businessman, whose perfectly tailored suit and polished leather briefcase were the very image of success. He had built his career from the ground up, navigating the cutthroat world of finance with a relentless drive. Yet, despite all his achievements, there was an emptiness that seemed to hang over him, a void that money, power, or the respect of his colleagues could never fill. Mark glanced at his gold watch, a constant reminder of the time slipping away. Another business trip, another day on the road. His mind wandered to the life he had built, the deals he had closed, the luxury that had become his world. But something gnawed at him, a feeling he couldn't quite place. Was it regret? Or perhaps it was something deeper, something tied to a past he had long since buried. It was then that his eyes caught something. Or rather, someone. A woman. Walking briskly past him, her brown hair swaying as she moved. In her hand, she held the small, delicate hand of a boy, no older than 10. Mark stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. The woman's face was unmistakable. Emma. His heart raced. And for a moment, he stood frozen in time, his mind scrambling to make sense of the sight before him. Emma, his wife. Or rather, the woman who had once been his wife, was here, in front of him. But that wasn't what stunned him the most. No, what truly left him speechless was the boy at her side. The boy, he looked so familiar. The same green eyes that Mark saw every morning in the mirror. The same unruly blonde hair, wild and free, just like his own had been when he was a child. Even the way the boy walked, confident, carefree, reminded Mark of himself at that age. It was as if he were looking at a reflection of his younger self. A wave of panic surged through Mark. Could it be? Could the boy be his son? The thought hit him like a punch to the stomach. 10 years ago, he had walked away from everything. From Emma. From the life they had built. From the future they had planned together. He had left a cold letter on the kitchen table. A letter that would alter both of their lives forever. Emma had been pregnant. And he hadn't known. How could he not have known? Mark's mind spiraled as he watched Emma and the boy disappear into the crowd. His legs wobbled beneath him, the weight of guilt and confusion threatening to crush him. He had abandoned Emma. But had he also abandoned his son? A son he never even knew existed? With a surge of determination, Mark began to push through the crowd, desperate to reach Emma and the boy. His heart raced in his chest, each beat pounding in his ears as he called out to them. Emma, he shouted, his voice barely cutting through the noise of the bustling airport. But it was no use. The crowd was too thick. And by the time Mark had fought his way through, Emma and the boy were gone. They had vanished without a trace. He stood there, panting, his eyes frantically scanning the terminal, hoping for a glimpse of them. But there was nothing. No sign of the woman he had once loved. No sign of the boy who might have been his son. "Sir, are you all right?" a flight attendant asked. Noticing his agitated state, Mark barely heard her, his mind too consumed by the image of Emma and the boy. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Olivia, his current wife. He ignored the call, still scanning the terminal for any sign of the past that had suddenly come rushing back into his life. "Sir, your flight is departing," the flight attendant insisted. Mark looked at her. Then at the boarding gate. He glanced back toward the crowded airport lobby. His mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. In that moment, he made a decision that would change his life forever. "I'm not boarding," he said. His voice distant, as if someone else were speaking. The flight attendant looked at him, surprised. But Mark was already walking away, his thoughts consumed by the need to find answers. He had to know the truth. He couldn't just leave now, not when everything was hanging in the balance. Mark hurried out of the terminal and hailed a cab. The driver nodded as he pulled into the traffic of downtown New York. Mark leaned back in the seat, his mind racing as he pulled out his phone. He ignored the missed calls from Olivia and dialed the number of an old friend, a private detective he had worked with on a few cases over the years. "Greg. It's Mark. I need your help," Mark said as soon as the line connected. Greg's voice on the other end was calm, but Mark could hear the curiosity in his tone. "What's going on?" "Mark. I need you to find someone for me," Mark said, trying to steady his voice. "Her name is Emma. And there's a boy. I think he's mine. I need to know everything about them." Mark explained the situation, detailing what he had seen at the airport and the overwhelming sense of guilt and confusion that had taken hold of him. He couldn't shake the image of the boy who might be his son. Greg listened intently, taking down notes. "I can get on this right away, Mark," he said. "But you realize, this could change everything. You sure you're ready for that?" Mark swallowed hard, his stomach tight. "I have to know. I can't just keep pretending everything's fine. I need to make this right." Greg sighed. "All right. I'll need some details. Last known address. Work. Anything that might help." Mark closed his eyes, trying to remember every detail about Emma. She had been a teacher, working at a school not far from where they had lived. The apartment they had shared was in a quiet neighborhood on the edge of the city. Mark provided as much information as he could. All the while his mind kept drifting back to the boy who might be his son. As the cab continued through the streets of New York, Mark felt a strange mixture of dread and hope. Hope that the boy could be his son. Hope that he hadn't missed out on something so important. But also dread about what he had abandoned and the wreckage he had left behind. Money, power, success. All of it seemed so irrelevant now. What mattered now was the truth. What mattered now was finding Emma and the boy and somehow making amends for the mistakes he had made so long ago. For the first time in years, Mark felt as if the weight of his life had shifted. The pursuit of wealth and status had consumed him for so long. But now it was nothing. What mattered now was family. And, perhaps, the chance to be a father. As the cab pulled into the city, Mark's thoughts were a whirlwind of emotions. But beneath it all was a determination he hadn't felt in a long time. He had made a terrible mistake. But he would do whatever it took to make things right. As Mark walked away from the taxi, the weight of his thoughts seemed to grow heavier. His hands trembled slightly, betraying the emotions he had been trying to suppress. Every street he passed seemed to echo with memories of a time when life had seemed simpler. When his world had consisted of only Emma and the small apartment they had shared together. How far he had strayed from that life. From that love. How easily he had let it slip through his fingers. The city seemed to blur around him, the buildings and streets merging into one endless haze. Mark's mind drifted back to a night in New York. A night that had changed everything. He had been there for work, trying to close a deal with a client who had been proving elusive. Frustrated after another long day of failed negotiations, he wandered into a hotel bar, seeking to unwind before the next morning's meetings. That was when he saw her. Olivia. Beautiful. Confident. Her eyes sparkled with ambition. A fire that seemed to promise adventure. She slid into the seat next to him and struck up a conversation with him as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Her smile was magnetic, pulling him in as she talked about power, money, and the lifestyle she led. "Hard day?" she had asked. her voice smooth and comforting. She wore an air of someone who was used to getting what she wanted. At first, Mark had resisted. He had been married to Emma for years. He had built a life with her. But slowly, as Olivia spoke, he found himself drawn into her world. She had a way of making everything sound possible: luxury, success, recognition. She made him feel small in his current life. And yet, at the same time, she made him feel as though he could be so much more. In the weeks that followed, Mark found himself taking more and more business trips, each one an excuse to see Olivia again. Each encounter left him wanting more of her. More of the promises she whispered about what life could be if he only reached for it. She would tell him how he deserved more, how with the right people around him, he could be a millionaire. She painted a picture of a life full of luxury and power, a life where his ambitions weren't limited by the small world he had with Emma. Emma had always been content with their simple life. She was a teacher, dedicated to her work and to Mark. She didn't ask for much. She had been supportive of his career, never once questioning his late nights or the endless trips he took. But as the months passed, Mark began to feel suffocated. Why settle for a life that felt small when he could have everything? Emma's quiet happiness, her simple dreams, now seemed like chains. She didn't understand his hunger for more. "Why do you need more, Mark?" she would ask him, her voice full of concern. "Aren't we happy as we are?" Mark would give her a smile, a reassuring one. But deep down, he knew he wasn't content. He wanted more, so much more. One chilly autumn night, after yet another fight with Emma, Mark made his decision. He had waited for Emma to fall asleep, her soft breathing filling the silence of their apartment. He packed a bag in haste, careful not to wake her. On the kitchen table, he left a letter, brief, cold, and final. Emma, the letter read, "I can't do this anymore. I need more from life than you can give me. Please don't try to find me. I'm sorry, Mark." It had been so easy in that moment. He didn't even think twice. The car was packed, the decision made. As he drove to the airport, a part of him felt relief, as though he was finally breaking free. A new life awaited him, one where he wouldn't have to settle for less. Olivia was waiting. The promises of a life filled with success and recognition were so close now. But even as he drove away, Mark felt a sting, a quiet voice inside his head that asked if he was doing the right thing. He shoved it aside. He couldn't afford to turn back now. Not when everything he had ever wanted was just within his reach. The few days that followed were a blur. He didn't look back. He didn't think about Emma. He didn't think about the life he had left behind. He threw himself into his new life with Olivia, into the whirlwind of high society, fast cars, and expensive dinners. It was intoxicating, and he let it consume him. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that just a few days later, Emma would discover she was pregnant. Alone and devastated, she sat with the pregnancy test in her hand, tears streaming down her face as she realized that the man she loved, the man who had walked out on her, had left her to face the future alone. Meanwhile, Mark was too busy with his new life to notice. Emma's pain, the life he had destroyed, was a distant memory. He had Olivia now. He had success. He had everything he had ever wanted. At least, that's what he told himself. But even in the midst of all this, a small part of him couldn't help but wonder what he had given up. What would life have been like if he had stayed with Emma? What if he had been there to witness the pregnancy? What if he had been there for the birth? These thoughts didn't come often. They were easily drowned out by the allure of the new life he had built. But now, as he walked through the streets of New York, they resurfaced. He had abandoned everything. And now, that everything was coming back to haunt him. The boy at the airport, Luke, Mark's son. His heart ached with the thought of him. He hadn't known. But the moment he saw the boy, something inside him had shifted. The guilt was overwhelming. How could he have walked away? How could he have left his own flesh and blood behind? As Mark moved closer to his destination, the weight of his past mistakes seemed to press down on him even more. He had everything: money, success, status. But none of it mattered now. What mattered now was the truth. What mattered now was the boy he had abandoned. The son he had never known. The journey ahead would be long. There would be no easy answers. But Mark knew that he had to face the truth. No matter how painful it might be. He couldn't undo the past. But he could at least try to make things right. And it all began with finding Emma and Luke. He was ready. Ready to confront his past and whatever consequences lay ahead. The past had shaped him. But now, it was time to shape his future. And that journey, his journey, was just beginning. Mark spent the next few days consumed by thoughts of the boy, Luke. Every detail about him haunted Mark. His green eyes. His tousled blonde hair. The way he carried himself. Mark couldn't escape the nagging feeling that this boy, this child, was his son. It wasn't just the physical resemblance, it was the connection. However brief. That had jolted him at the airport. He had abandoned Emma without knowing she was pregnant. He had no idea how much he had missed. How much he had let slip through his fingers. Now, there was a chance, just a small one, that he could make things right. After his conversation with Greg, the detective, Mark found himself pacing the hotel room, trying to process everything that had unfolded in such a short amount of time. The phone call had been brief, but it confirmed everything he feared. Greg had told him that Emma still lived in the same neighborhood, raising a 10-year-old son named Luke. Mark's heart had pounded in his chest as he listened, the weight of his past crashing down on him once again. A son. His son. Mark couldn't help but think back to those early years with Emma. They had been so young, full of dreams, full of hope. When they were together, everything seemed possible. They had talked about building a life, about having children, about growing old together. But somewhere along the way, ambition had taken over. Mark's desire for success, for recognition, for more, he had let all of it consume him. And now, there was a child, his child, that he had never known. A child who had grown up without a father. Without him. The phone call from Greg had felt like a turning point. But now that he knew where Emma and Luke were, Mark was at a loss. What should he do? How could he just show up after 10 years of silence? What could he possibly say to make up for the pain he had caused? Despite his reservations, Mark knew that he had to try. He couldn't let fear hold him back. He had already run once, he wouldn't run again. For the first time in years, he realized that the money, the power, the success, all of it had been distractions. All of it had been a way to avoid the real work, the work of facing himself. Of facing his mistakes. He had to confront Emma. He had to find out if Luke was truly his son. And if he was, Mark knew that he couldn't just disappear again. He had to be a father. As Mark walked through the streets of New York, the weight of the decision grew heavier with every step. He knew that finding Emma and Luke wouldn't be easy. There was so much history between them. So much pain that he had caused. How could he possibly repair the damage he had done? But deep down, Mark knew that this was the only path forward. He had to try. He owed it to Emma. He owed it to Luke. When Mark arrived at the address Greg had given him, his heart skipped a beat. The neighborhood looked different than he remembered. The houses were small, modest, nothing like the sleek, modern spaces he was used to. There was a familiarity in the air. A kind of simplicity that Mark had long since left behind. As he stood in front of the house, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the years pressing down on him. He had chosen a different path. One that led him away from Emma. One that led him away from this life. But now, standing on the doorstep of a house that should have been his, he realized how wrong he had been. Mark knocked. The sound echoing in the stillness of the morning. He felt a lump form in his throat. His breath catching in his chest. What was he doing here? Was he even welcome? What if Emma didn't want to see him? What if she hated him for what he had done? The door opened. And for a moment, Mark froze. Emma stood in front of him, looking as beautiful as he remembered. Though there was a quiet strength in her eyes now. She had changed in ways that Mark couldn't have anticipated. She wasn't the same woman he had left all those years ago. She was stronger, more guarded. And her eyes, they held a sadness that Mark could never have imagined. "What are you doing here?" Emma asked. Her voice calm but cold. There was no anger in her tone. Just a deep sense of hurt. Mark opened his mouth to speak. But no words came out. The guilt, the regret, it all hit him at once. For a moment, he was paralyzed. How could he even begin to explain? How could he make up for what he had done? I had to see you. Mark finally managed. His voice shaky. I had to see him. Emma's eyes narrowed slightly, and Mark felt a wave of anxiety wash over him. She wasn't going to let him in. She wasn't going to let him explain. But then, she stepped aside. A hesitant invitation. Mark hesitated for a moment before walking into the house. It was small, cozy, a far cry from the sterile luxury of his own apartment. The walls were lined with family photos, snapshots of a life that Mark had never been a part of. As he entered the living room, Mark saw the boy Luke sitting on the couch, reading a book. He looked up as Mark approached, his expression one of quiet curiosity. "Luke," Emma said softly, her voice steady but strained. "This is Mark." Mark's heart thudded painfully in his chest as the boy looked up at him. There was no mistaking it, the resemblance was undeniable. The green eyes, the blonde hair, even the way Luke Saturday, the way he carried himself. It was as if Mark were looking at his younger self. The realization hit him like a jolt. This was his son. Luke stared at Mark for a long moment, his gaze unreadable. Finally, he spoke, his voice small but steady. "Are you really my dad?" Mark swallowed hard. This was it. The moment he had both dreaded and longed for. I think so," Mark said, his voice barely a whisper. "I think I am." The room fell silent, the weight of the moment settling between them. Emma watched from a distance, her expression unreadable. For Mark, this was the first step, a small one, but a step nonetheless. He had no idea where it would lead, but he knew that it was a beginning, and that was all he needed. As he sat down beside Luke, Mark realized that he couldn't undo the past. He couldn't erase the mistakes he had made, but he could try to make things right. He could be the father that Luke deserved. And no matter what happened next, Mark was determined to be there for his son. Mark sat on the couch, his heart pounding in his chest as he glanced at Luke. The boy's expression was unreadable, and Mark could feel the weight of the silence hanging in the air like a storm ready to break. Emma stood in the doorway, her gaze fixed on him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She hadn't said much since he'd entered the house, but Mark could feel the tension in her every move. After years of distance, of avoiding the truth, Mark was finally face to face with the consequences of his actions. He had left Emma, abandoned her, without a second thought. He had never even known about Luke. But now, standing here in front of him, it was clear that this boy, his son, was a part of a life he had been too blind to see. The guilt, the shame, was overwhelming. For a few moments, neither Mark nor Luke spoke. It was as if the room was suspended in time, and everything that had happened in the years before, all the choices that had led to this point, hung in the air like a heavy fog. Mark's mind raced. How could he possibly explain everything to Luke? How could he even begin to make up for the years he had lost? Luke shifted slightly on the couch, his small hands clenched in his lap. He looked at Mark for a long moment before breaking the silence. "So, you're my dad?" he asked, his voice tentative but strong. There was no anger in his words, only a quiet curiosity, but Mark could hear the faint tremor in Luke's voice. The boy was trying to make sense of what was happening, of the man who had just appeared in his life, claiming to be his father. Mark nodded slowly, his heart aching with every beat. "I think so," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I know I made a terrible mistake. Luke. I should have been here. I should have been with you and your mom." Luke's eyes flickered with a mix of emotions, confusion, skepticism, and something deeper. Something that Mark couldn't quite place. But before Mark could say anything else, Emma stepped forward, her voice cutting through the thick silence. "You're right about one thing, Mark," she said, her tone cold, though there was an undercurrent of something more, something hurt, something broken. "You should have been here, but you weren't. And now, you just expect to walk in and act like everything's fine?" Mark flinched at the sharpness in her words. But he didn't look away. He couldn't. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. "I never meant to hurt you, Emma. I never meant for any of this to happen." Emma shook her head slowly, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and anger. "No, Mark. You didn't mean to hurt anyone. But you did. You hurt me. You hurt Luke. And you hurt yourself." Mark's chest tightened as Emma's words sank in. He had left her. He had chosen ambition, wealth, and the promises of a life that seemed so much better than what he had with her. But none of that had brought him the peace he had been searching for. None of it had filled the emptiness inside of him. "I made mistakes," Mark admitted, his voice thick with regret. "I was selfish. I was blind. I thought I needed more. But what I really needed was you. Both of you." Luke shifted again, his eyes now focused on Mark, studying him with an intensity that made Mark's heart ache. The boy was searching for answers, trying to understand who this man was and why he was suddenly in his life. And Mark couldn't blame him for his skepticism. He had no right to expect trust or forgiveness from Luke. Not after everything he had done. But Mark wasn't going to give up. He couldn't. Not now that he knew the truth. Not now that he had seen Luke. Felt the weight of his presence. The echo of his own blood in the boy's eyes. He had a chance, just a slim chance, to make things right. And for the first time in years, he was determined to take it. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Luke," Mark said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I don't expect everything to be okay overnight. But I want to be here for you. I want to get to know you. I want to make up for the time I lost." There was a long pause, and Mark held his breath, waiting for Luke's response. But the boy didn't say anything. Instead, he stood up abruptly, his face a mix of frustration and confusion. "I don't want to talk about this right now," Luke said, his voice tight. "I don't know who you are. I don't even know if I want to know." With that, Luke walked out of the room, leaving Mark and Emma standing in the silence that followed. Mark's heart sank. He had hoped that Luke would at least be willing to listen, to understand. But he was just a child who had been abandoned by his father and had learned to live without him. Of course, it wasn't going to be easy. Emma let out a long sigh, her shoulders slumping as the weight of the situation settled in. "You can't just show up after 10 years. Mark," she said softly. "It's not that simple. You can't erase the past with a few words." Mark nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle deep inside him. He hadn't expected things to be easy. He hadn't expected forgiveness. But the pain of knowing what he had done, the life he had missed, was a burden he was going to have to carry for the rest of his life. "I don't expect things to be easy," Mark said quietly. "I know I've ruined a lot of things. But I'm here now. And I'm not going anywhere." Emma looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded, though there was no softness in her eyes. "We'll see," she said quietly. As Mark stood there, alone in the quiet house, he realized that the journey ahead would be a long one. There was no quick fix for the damage he had done. But he wasn't going to give up. He couldn't. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of what it meant to be a father. And though the road ahead was uncertain, he was ready to take the first step, no matter how difficult it might be. And so, Mark began the slow process of rebuilding the relationships he had destroyed. With every step forward, he knew there would be setbacks, moments of doubt, and frustration. But for the first time in his life, he was willing to fight for something that mattered. For the first time in his life, he was fighting for the chance to be the father Luke deserved. The days that followed were an unsettling whirlwind for Mark. His mind was consumed by the encounter with Luke and Emma. The boy's uncertainty and the mother's guarded anger were like wounds Mark had inflicted on himself. Wounds that now seemed impossible to heal. He had known it wouldn't be easy, but standing before his son and seeing the coldness in Luke's eyes, the emotional walls Emma had built around herself, was a hard pill to swallow. Yet, amidst the pain, Mark couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. He had shown up. He had confronted his past. And in doing so, he had found a small thread of possibility. But that thread was fragile. Very fragile. Mark's nights were filled with restless sleep, each dream haunted by guilt. He could still see Luke's face, young and confused, and Emma's sadness. The pain of years lost. And the love he had failed to honor. His mind often drifted back to the very beginning. To the choices that had led him here. It was the desire for wealth and recognition that had clouded his judgment for so long. But now, in the stillness of the night, Mark was acutely aware of how much he had sacrificed for those illusions. It wasn't just Emma and Luke that he had wronged, it was himself. His own values had been corrupted by his ambition, his hunger for success, and the promises of a life he never truly wanted. It had taken a decade of chasing after power and status for Mark to realize that what truly mattered couldn't be bought. One evening, Mark found himself sitting in his hotel room, staring out at the city skyline. He could feel the weight of his past pressing down on him, the consequences of his actions looming over him like a storm. As he reached for the phone, his fingers trembled. He dialed the number of his lawyer, his heart sinking as the phone rang. Mark. The voice on the other end was familiar, but it was strained, filled with an underlying sense of urgency. What's going on? I haven't heard from you in days. I need to talk to you, Mark said quietly, his throat tight with the knowledge of what he was about to confess. I need to come clean. About everything. There was a brief pause. What do you mean? Everything? The lawyer's voice shifted, sounding more cautious now. Mark. Are you in trouble? Yes, Mark said, closing his eyes. I've been hiding things. Business deals. Bribes. A lot of things that are not right. The weight of the admission felt like a lead weight in his chest. He had built his empire on the backs of lies. On shady deals. On corruption. In the pursuit of wealth. He had turned a blind eye to the ethical lines he had crossed, thinking that the end would justify the means. But now, facing the truth about his personal life, about his son, Mark couldn't live with those lies anymore. He couldn't pretend that they didn't matter. You have to tell the truth, Mark, the lawyer said after a moment of silence. This could get ugly. You know that, right? You might lose everything. I don't care, Mark replied, his voice firm, though the weight of his decision made his hands shake. I need to fix this. I can't keep living like this. The past has caught up with me, and I'm ready to face it. The lawyer let out a long sigh. All right. I'll make arrangements. But Mark, you need to be ready for the consequences. This will affect everything, your business, your assets, your reputation. You're talking about throwing away everything you've built. Mark didn't respond immediately. He just sat there, staring at the skyline, feeling the truth settle within him. He had already lost so much. Losing his wealth, his status, even his freedom. It was a small price to pay for the chance to rebuild what really mattered. The road ahead would be difficult. But Mark was ready to take responsibility for his actions. He had to. The next morning, Mark met with his lawyer and the necessary legal advisors. The conversation was a blur of terms he didn't want to hear: fraud, bribery, financial mismanagement. Each word seemed to hit him harder than the last. He had tried to bury his past, to push it all down. But now it was all coming to light. There was no turning back now. He had made his confession, and the consequences were inevitable. As the news of his financial misdeeds began to leak out, Mark found himself at the center of a media storm. Reporters camped outside his hotel, flashing cameras and shouting questions about the scandal. His name, once associated with wealth and success, was now a symbol of corruption and deceit. His business partners, the ones who had once admired him for his sharp mind and ambition, began to distance themselves from him. Some even cut ties altogether. It was clear that Mark's empire was crumbling. But even as his world collapsed around him, Mark felt something inside him shift. For the first time in years, he wasn't focused on the damage to his reputation. He wasn't worried about the financial ruin that loomed ahead. What mattered now was the truth about his life, his mistakes, and his family. And that truth had already begun to unravel. Back at Emma's house, the consequences of Mark's actions began to seep into their lives as well. The news coverage of his financial crimes had spread quickly, and Emma found herself confronting the reality of the situation. Luke, too, was aware of the media frenzy, though he didn't fully understand what was going on. But the tension in the air was palpable. Emma had hoped to shield Luke from the worst of it, but it was impossible to avoid. One evening, as Emma prepared dinner, Mark stood outside her house, staring at the familiar front door. His heart was heavy with everything that had transpired. He had told the truth. He had admitted his wrongdoings. But the damage was far from over. There was so much he couldn't fix. So much that had already been broken. It wasn't just his business that had fallen apart. It was his chance at redemption. His opportunity to rebuild his relationship with Emma and Luke. But for the first time in his life, Mark was no longer running from the consequences of his actions. He was facing them head-on, ready to take whatever came next. He had lost everything: his wealth, his status, his reputation. But in that moment, Mark understood something important. The price of truth was steep, but it was the only way forward. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was the beginning of something new. The days after Mark's confession were nothing short of a whirlwind. His life, once marked by opulence and control, had spiraled into chaos. His company was being investigated, his personal assets frozen, and his reputation shattered beyond repair. For years, Mark had run from his mistakes, buried them under the weight of his ambition. But now he had to face every consequence head-on. But, in the midst of the storm, something shifted inside him. He had always prided himself on being in control, on manipulating situations to his benefit. But for the first time, Mark had let go of that illusion. He had made the decision to take responsibility for his wrongdoings. And though the path ahead was unclear, he was no longer afraid of facing the truth. He had learned that true strength wasn't about maintaining power or manipulating others, it was about facing your own flaws, your own guilt, and having the courage to change. Mark's phone was filled with missed calls and messages from reporters, clients, and old colleagues. Some had offered support, while others distanced themselves, eager to protect their own interests from the fallout. But the noise of the outside world seemed to fade into the background as Mark focused on the one thing that truly mattered: rebuilding his life. A few days after his confession, Mark called his lawyer again. The investigation into his financial activities was intensifying. But he knew he couldn't hide behind legal jargon any longer. The only way to move forward was to come clean completely. "I'm ready to face whatever comes," Mark said into the phone. "It's time to own up to everything. I'm not running anymore." His lawyer's voice was tense, but Mark could hear the approval in it. "We'll start putting everything together. The fallout is going to be huge, but we'll manage it." Mark hung up the phone. the weight of his decision settling deep into his bones. He had already lost so much. But what remained, the small but significant connections with the people who mattered, was what he intended to fight for. And, above all, that meant facing Emma and Luke again. He knew the journey to rebuilding his relationship with them wouldn't be easy. Emma was still processing the pain of the past, the betrayal of his disappearance, and the years of struggle that followed. And Luke, his son, was still carrying the wounds of abandonment. Mark had no illusion that they would forgive him overnight. But he couldn't give up. He couldn't walk away this time. One afternoon, Mark found himself in front of Emma's house again, his heart in his throat. He had spent the last few days working on the legal matters surrounding his finances. But his thoughts kept returning to Emma and Luke. He hadn't seen them since that painful confrontation. He had no idea how they felt or whether they were even willing to hear him out. As he stood outside the house, he felt his resolve faltering for just a moment. But then, he remembered the truth he had learned in the past few weeks, the truth about himself. About what truly mattered. He took a deep breath, steeled himself, and walked up to the door. Emma answered it this time, her expression cautious but not angry. Mark could see the tiredness in her eyes, the weight of everything she had endured on her own all these years. "Mark," she said softly, but there was no warmth in her voice. "What are you doing here? I know I don't deserve your forgiveness." Mark began, his voice thick with emotion. "But I've made a decision. I'm not going to run anymore. I'm here to make things right. If there's any chance at all, I want to try to be part of Luke's life. And I want to help you, if you'll let me." Emma looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. For a brief instant, Mark thought she might close the door and walk away, leaving him to his regrets. But instead, she stepped aside, opening the door wider. "I don't know if there's a place for you in our lives, Mark," she said quietly, her voice soft but firm. "But I don't want to keep running from the past either. You've already caused enough damage. But maybe it's time we start moving forward. For Luke's sake." Mark stepped inside, his heart pounding. He had no idea what this new chapter would bring. But he knew that, for the first time in his life, he was ready to face it. No more hiding. No more running away. He would fight for the chance to rebuild what he had broken. Later that evening, after dinner, Mark found himself sitting on the couch across from Luke. The boy had barely spoken since Mark arrived, his gaze fixed on the floor. Mark knew that he couldn't rush this. He couldn't expect Luke to suddenly embrace him as a father after 10 years of absence. But just being there, in the same room, was a start. "I don't expect anything from you, Luke," Mark said, his voice low and gentle. "I know I've hurt you and your mom. I don't know if I can make up for all the years I lost. But I want to try. I want to be part of your life. If you'll let me. I can't change the past. But I can be here now. I'm not going anywhere." Luke didn't look up immediately, but Mark could see a shift in the boy's posture. It wasn't much, but it was a sign that he was listening. After a long moment, Luke finally spoke, his voice hesitant but sincere. "Why now?" Mark sighed, feeling the weight of the question. "Because I've been blind, Luke. I've spent my whole life chasing after things that don't matter. I thought money, power, success would make me happy, but they didn't. I was wrong. And I realize now that I've missed out on the one thing that truly matters, being there for the people I love." The words hung in the air between them, fragile but true. Mark knew that it wouldn't be easy for Luke to accept him. But for the first time in years, Mark felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, hope. For the first time in a long time, he was starting to rebuild. Not his wealth or his reputation, but something more important. His connection to the people who mattered most. As the evening wore on, the tension in the room seemed to ease. Emma, too, was quieter than usual. But Mark could see a glimmer of something new in her eyes, maybe hope. Or maybe just the possibility of forgiveness. The road ahead was still uncertain. But for the first time in a long time, Mark felt as though he was on the right path. He had made mistakes. Yes. But he was determined to make them right. One step at a time. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. The future was still a long way off. But Mark was willing to face it. He had lost so much. But in the process, he was beginning to realize that what really mattered, the chance to be a father. To build a life based on love and integrity, was something no amount of wealth or success could ever buy. For the first time in his life, Mark was ready to live with purpose. And as he sat there, in Emma's small living room, he knew that this was only the beginning. As Mark walked out of Emma's house that evening, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. It wasn't the peace of having everything figured out, but rather the peace that comes with knowing you've finally started the right journey. The road ahead would be difficult, full of moments of doubt and setbacks. But Mark was ready to face them. He had learned that true success was not measured by wealth or power, but by love, honesty, and the courage to make amends. His future was uncertain. But for the first time, it felt like a future worth fighting for. Thank you for following Mark's journey. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more real-life transformations, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for new updates. Stay with us for more life stories that inspire change and growth.